Clara. Wren folded her grandmother's winter dress across the top of a cardboard box and pressed both hands flat against the fabric until the lid would close. The dress still smelled faintly of lavender soap and the cedar chest Lila had kept at the foot of their rented room, and for one careless second, Clara almost called out to ask whether the blue buttons should go with the keepsakes or the church clothes. Then the landlord knocked again, not hard. Mr. Denton was not a cruel man. That almost made it worse. He stood on the outside stairs of the old duplex with his cap in both hands, looking anywhere but at the room where Clara had spent the last 3 years measuring pills into plastic cups, warming soup on a hot plate, and sleeping lightly enough to hear her grandmother breathe. "Clara," he said through the door, "I can give you till noon." She looked at the clock on the windowsill, 10:17. "Thank you," she said, though the words had no shape in her mouth. By 11, the room had become a row of decisions she did not have the strength to make. Donate, trash, keep. The oxygen machine had already gone back to the rental company. The narrow bed belonged to the furnished room. The chair by the window, where Clara Wren had sat wrapped in a gray knit scarf and watched rain slide down the glass, was too worn for the thrift store and too large for Clara's car. She kept the scarf. It went into the front seat beside a canvas sewing kit, 2 changes of clothes, a folder of hospice receipts, and a paper envelope from Hale and Mercer, attorneys at law. She had not opened the envelope yet. Mr. Hale had given it to her after the funeral, holding it with both hands as if it weighed more than paper. "Your grandmother asked me to wait," he had said. "She said you would know when there was nowhere else to go." At the time, Clara had been too tired to be angry. Now, standing in the yard while Mr. Denton locked the upstairs door behind her, anger arrived late and small. Not at him. Not even at Lila. It settled in Clara's chest like a coal with no fire left in it. She was 26 years old. She had $312 in cash, a debit card she was afraid to check, and a car with a heater that complained whenever she turned it past low. In the trunk were 2 boxes of a life that had once included schedules, prescriptions, oatmeal, folded towels, and the soft clack of Lila's knitting needles at night. Mr. Denton came down the steps and handed her the mailbox key. "Storage company comes Friday," he said. "I told them there wasn't much." "There isn't," Clara said. He nodded, looked at the scarf in her hand, and lowered his voice. "Your grandma was a good woman." Clara wanted to say something generous back. Instead, she got into the car before her face could break open. She drove 3 blocks before pulling into the parking lot of a closed laundromat. The sign in the window said "Out of order" on a sheet of notebook paper. Clara laughed once, a dry sound that startled her. Then she opened the attorney's envelope with her thumb. Inside was a brass key, darkened at the bow, a folded deed, and 1 page in her grandmother's careful handwriting. "My Clara, if you are reading this, I have left you less comfort than I hoped and more responsibility than you asked for. There is a chapel outside Black Mountain. It is not pretty now. It may not be safe. But it is yours in the only way I could make it yours. Mr. Hale will explain the taxes. Do not let anyone carry off the bell before you have heard it for yourself. I'm sorry I waited. Layla." Clara read the last line twice. Then she turned the deed over and found the county description, the parcel number, and a transfer amount of $1. The property was listed as Wren Chapel, Old Laurel Branch Road, Buncombe County, North Carolina. She had never heard of it. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Mr. Hale answered on the second ring, his voice softened by age and office carpet. "She meant for me to call you tomorrow," he said after Clara read the first words of Lila's note. "But I imagine you opened it." "What chapel?" A pause. "It was attached to your great-grandmother's side of the family. Not active for many years. Your grandmother paid the minimum taxes when she could. Then she couldn't. Is it worth anything? To a developer, not much. To a salvage man, perhaps the bell and some interior wood. To the county, it is a liability if the roof gives way." Clara looked through her windshield at the laundromat's dark dryers, round doors, clouded with old soap. "Why didn't she sell it?" "She would not discuss that with me," Mr. Hale said. "Only that if you ever had to choose between letting it be stripped and standing inside it, once you should stand inside it once." "That's not legal advice." "No," he said. "It is exactly the kind of instruction your grandmother tended to leave." By early afternoon, Clara was on Interstate 40 heading west beneath a low, pewter sky. Asheville came and went in a blur of traffic, brick buildings, and bare sycamore branches. Beyond it, the road tightened toward the mountains. Black Mountain sat in Buncombe County, a Blue Ridge town tucked where ridge lines shouldered close to the highway. Clara had passed exits like it before without wondering who lived beyond the gas stations and church signs. Now every mile felt like a question she had not agreed to answer. Old Laurel Branch Road was narrower than the map promised. It climbed past winter-browned rhododendron and washed gravel, then bent along a creek bed where rain had carved pale ruts through the shoulder. Clara's car bumped hard enough to make the sewing kit slide against the passenger door. By the time she saw the chapel, the afternoon had thinned to the color of cold dishwater. It stood back from the road in a clearing that had nearly reclaimed it. The building was smaller than she expected and lonelier than she was ready for. White clapboard peeled from the walls in curled strips. The front porch sagged at one corner, its steps tilted as if tired of holding themselves up. A tin roof ran rust-red along the seams, and above it a square belfry lifted through the bare branches' louvered openings, dark on all four sides. The bell was still there. Clara could see its lower rim through the slats, a dull bronze curve against shadow. Below it, the chapel door hung closed under a shallow arch. One east window was cracked from corner to corner, and the fieldstone foundation had lost mortar in patches where weeds grew from the joints. She parked at the edge of the clearing and sat with both hands on the wheel. The practical thing would have been to photograph it, call Mr. Hale and ask how quickly a person could give back a $1 chapel. The county could have it. The salvage man could have it. Anyone who knew how to keep rain out of a roof could have it. But Lila's scarf lay in the passenger seat, gray wool folded over the brass key. Clara put on her olive canvas coat and stepped into the wet grass. The air smelled of leaves, stone, and old water. Somewhere downhill, a dog barked twice and went quiet. She walked around the porch instead of trusting it, testing the ground with each step. At the north wall, she found a place where clapboards had pulled loose enough to show dark framing behind them. At the rear, a little vestry leaned out from the main building, its single window filmed white with age. The roof over that section had lost a strip of tin and rain, had marked the wall below in a long brown stain. "No," Clara whispered, though she did not know what she was refusing. She came back to the front and climbed the porch where the boards looked least rotten. One dipped under her boot with a soft complaint. She froze, shifted her weight, then reached the door. The key did not turn at first. She worked it gently, feeling grit resist inside the lock. On the fourth try, the bolt gave with a thick click that seemed too loud for the clearing. Inside the chapel held the cold. 2 short rows of pews faced a plain raised platform. No pulpit remained, only a rectangular mark on the floor where one had stood. Beadboard walls rose toward a stained ceiling, and narrow stairs along the back led to a choir loft. The air tasted of dust and damp paper. A hymnal lay open on the floor, its pages swollen into waves. Clara lifted her phone, but the screen showed 1 bar and 15% battery. "Of course," she said. She found the rope near the front, or what was left of it. It hung from a round hole in the ceiling just ahead of the loft rail, thick as her thumb, cut clean about 6 feet above the floor. The lower end was gone. The remaining rope was dark with age, its fibers stiff, no longer reaching any human hand. 40 years, Mr. Hale had said when she called from the road to ask if the bell worked. No one has rung it in 40 years. The rope was cut after a storm damaged the belfry. Your grandmother paid once for an inspection, then never again. Clara stood beneath the rope and looked up into the dim space above the ceiling. She could not see the bell from inside. Only the hole, the rope stump, and a faint draft moving dust where daylight leaked through the belfry louvers. For the first time all day, she felt something besides loss press against her ribs. Not hope. Hope was too large a word. Attention. She spent the last of the light making sure the floor would hold her weight. The center aisle boards were cupped but firm. The left pews smelled of mouse droppings. The right wall had taken water near the cracked window. She did not climb the loft stairs. The third step was split and the rail above it leaned outward. She photographed the damage until her phone died, then went back to the car as evening settled into the trees. There was no money for a motel. She ate peanut butter from a plastic spoon, wrapped Lila's scarf around her neck, and reclined the driver's seat as far as the boxes and back allowed. The chapel filled the windshield pale and fractured under the rising moon. Clara tried to imagine her grandmother here as a girl sweeping between pews, lighting a stove, hiding from rain. The image would not steady itself. Sleep came in torn pieces. Once near midnight she woke to rain tapping the roof of the car. Once a branch scraped the passenger window. Once she dreamed of Lila knitting with the cut bell rope instead of yarn, pulling loop after loop through her fingers until the whole chapel began to sway. At dawn the cold woke her completely. The windshield was fogged from the inside. Clara rubbed a circle clear with her sleeve. The clearing beyond was silver with frost, the grass bent under a thin white skin. Above the chapel the belfry stood black against a pale seam of morning. Then the bell rang, one note, low, cracked at the edge, and full enough to move through the glass, through Clara's coat, through the place where she had locked away Lila's last apology. It rolled once across the clearing and faded into the trees. Clara did not move. Her first thought was that someone was inside. Her second was that no one could have crossed the porch without her hearing it. Her third came slower, colder, with the shape of the chapel interior around it. The rope had been cut. She opened the car door and stepped into the frost without taking her keys. The air bit her fingers. Her boots darkened in the wet grass as she crossed the clearing, climbed the porch, and pushed the chapel door inward. Nothing moved inside. The pews waited in their two narrow rows. The cut rope hung exactly where it had hung the evening before, 6 feet. Outside the frost began to melt from the porch rail in tiny drops. Inside the chapel held its silence as if nothing had happened. Clara stood in wet grass below the belfry, staring at the cut rope through the open chapel door. Clara pushed the chapel door open with her shoulder and swept broken glass away with the side of her boot. The pieces had fallen inward from the cracked east window, thin greenish shards scattered across the floorboards like frozen water. She made a path wide enough for her feet, then stood still and listened. Nothing answered. The bell rope hung above the aisle, cut and motionless. In the pale morning, it looked less like a mystery than a thing neglected until it had given up being useful. Clara stepped beneath it, lifted one hand and stopped before her fingers reached the frayed end. Touching it felt like disturbing evidence, though she had no idea what evidence could exist in an empty chapel with a locked door and frost still melting on the porch. She found an old broom in the rear vestry, its straw head chewed thin by mice. The vestry was a narrow room behind the platform with one small window, a rusted stovepipe collar in the wall, and shelves bowed under hymnals, candle stubs, and a chipped enamel basin. The ceiling there had taken water. A brown stain spread from the missing strip of tin outside, dark at the center and feathered at the edges. When Clara pressed the beadboard beneath it, the wood gave, slightly soft as a bruised apple. Not safe, she said, because saying it made her feel less alone. She worked from the back toward the front, not cleaning so much as learning where the building could bear weight. The nave floor dipped near the left row of pews, but did not bounce. The right wall had a cold draft where clapboards had pulled away from the framing. The vestibule smelled sharply of mildew. A bird nest sat in the corner above the door, empty except for a shred of blue plastic woven through grass. The chapel was simple, but it had been made by hands that expected it to last. The pews were plain and pine-worn smooth along the top rails where palms had rested. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass mostly clear, except for one small panel over the platform where amber and soft green pieces formed a mountain shape. The raised platform held only the pale rectangle where a pulpit had once stood. Behind it, a little door opened to the vestry. Above the entrance, the choir loft ran the width of the building, its rail leaning outward in a way that made Clara keep her distance. The stairs to the loft were worse than they had looked the night before. The first 2 treads were dusty but whole. The third had split along the grain, and the fourth sagged away from the wall. Clara set one boot on the first step, put a little weight on it, then stepped back down. "No," she said again. Outside, she walked the perimeter with her phone plugged into the car charger and her notebook open against the hood. She wrote down what she could see: porch corner down, east window cracked, roof seam rusted, vestry, roof open foundation, mortar missing, belfry unknown. The words looked professional until she read them back. Then they looked like a list of reasons to leave. A county notice was stapled to the front post at eye-level damp at the corners under a plastic sleeve. Unsafe structure review. Buncombe County Building. Safety initial inspection requested. Owner response required within 30 days. Below, that in smaller print, was a warning about unsecured openings, roof failure, and public hazard. Clara read it twice, then checked the date. 3 weeks ago. Her stomach tightened. Lila had been alive 3 weeks ago, sleeping more than waking, asking for water in a voice that had become almost formal with pain. Had she known the notice was coming? Had she heard about it and folded the knowledge into silence, the way she folded bills beneath the sugar tin when money ran thin? A truck came slowly up the gravel road before Clara could answer herself. It was a white pickup with a dented tailgate and a magnetic sign on the door: Ridge Salvage and Reclaim. The driver parked without asking, stepped out, and looked at the chapel the way some people looked at meat behind glass. He wore a tan jacket, clean work gloves, and sunglasses, though the sky was still gray. "You the Wren girl?" he asked. Clara closed her notebook. Clara Wren. Martin Voss. He did not offer his hand. "I talked to your grandmother once. Shame about her passing." The sentence landed flat. His eyes had already moved to the belfry. "I'm not selling anything," Clara said, surprising herself with the speed of it. Voss smiled as if she had answered a different question. "You don't know what you've got or what it's going to cost you. County tags a place like this, they don't wait forever. Roof goes, walls follow. Then you pay someone to haul the mess away." Clara glanced at the porch corner, then back at him. "What do you want?" "The bell, if it's sound, some pew wood, maybe that little colored window. I'd take it careful, pay cash. Leave the site clean enough that the county sees progress." "How much?" "For the bell and interior pieces, $1,200. $1,200. The number opened in Clara's mind with cruel brightness. It was rent somewhere cheap for a month. It was storage fees, gas, groceries time. It was enough to make her aware of the mud on her boots and the empty place where a home should be. Voss saw the hesitation. "I can come back with equipment tomorrow," he said. "Once weather turns, that road gets worse." Clara looked up at the belfry. Behind the dark louvers, the bell waited with its single impossible note. "I need to inspect it first. You climb up there, you'll break your neck. Then I need someone else to inspect it." His smile thinned. "Suit yourself. But if the county condemns it outright, nobody pays you for being sentimental." He left a business card tucked into the plastic sleeve of the notice. Clara watched his truck roll downhill until the trees swallowed the sound. By noon, cold had settled into her sleeves. She drove into town because her phone had 2% battery, and she needed coffee more than pride. Black Mountain looked almost gentle after the chapel brick storefronts, bare maples. A hardware store with wreaths in the window, people carrying paper cups as if ordinary life had not become a foreign country. At the public library, she asked to use an outlet and searched the county property records until the screen blurred. The chapel parcel was real. The unpaid taxes were real. So was the unsafe structure review. She wrote down the inspector's number, then sat with her hands wrapped around a paper cup she could barely afford. A woman with silver hair and red reading glasses paused beside her table. "You looking at Wren Chapel?" Clara straightened. "Do you know it?" "May Ellison. Local history room." The woman tapped the printout with one finger. "Most people forget the name. They call it the old Laurel Chapel now. My grandmother left it to me." May's face changed, not dramatically, but enough that Clara noticed. "Lila Wren." Clara nodded. She came in every spring and asked for the same folder. Never checked it out. Just sat with it for an hour. May glanced toward the back room. "If you come tomorrow, I can pull what we have. Sanborn maps won't help much out there, but there are church notes, road records, a few photographs. Was there ever a reason the bell would ring by itself?" May held Clara's gaze for a quiet second. "Around here, old buildings make noises when the weather changes. This was a bell. Then I would ask Jonah Price before I climbed anything. That was how Clara ended up at a small house behind the hardware store following directions written on the back of her receipt. Jonah Price opened the door with a carpenter's pencil behind one ear and a dish towel in his hand. He was tall in the stooped way of men who had spent years under beams with white hair cropped close and sawdust caught in the cuff of his flannel shirt. "I don't do roofs anymore," he said before Clara finished explaining. "I don't need you to do it. I need to know if I'm imagining things." He considered that, then looked past her toward the mountains. "That chapel still standing. Mostly gets people hurt. I won't climb." "Good." He closed the door halfway, then opened it again with a sigh. "Let me get my coat." Jonah brought a ladder, a canvas tool bag, and a flashlight bright enough to turn the chapel dust silver. He did not speak much on the drive. At the clearing, he stood beside Clara's car for nearly a minute, studying the roofline. The porch, the belfry, and the way the building leaned so slightly, she had almost missed it. "Your grandmother had stubborn in her bones," he said. "You knew her." Everybody knew Miss Lila enough to owe her something. Inside, he made Clara stay 3 paces behind him. He tested boards with the heel of his boot, shone the flashlight along the ceiling stains, and refused to step onto the loft stairs after one look. Third tread's split. Stringer may be pulling loose. Belfry's over that, and water's been coming in from the east. Nobody goes up until it's braced. The bell rang this morning. Jonah aimed the light at the cut rope. "That rope isn't moving anything." "I know. Could be metal contracting, could be a branch hit the bell." The note came once, clean. "Clean to you." He walked to the platform and looked up through the dimness above the loft. Bells don't need much to speak. A loose clapper, a shifted hanger wind in the right place. Wind rang it. "I said wind can move what's already loose. Not that it writes hymns." For the first time in days, Clara almost smiled. A gust pressed against the east side of the chapel. The cracked window ticked in its frame. Dust lifted from the floorboards in a thin breath. Above them, somewhere inside the belfry metal answered with a faint, dull tap. Not a full ring. Not the note that had woken her. But close enough that Clara felt the skin along her arms tighten. Jonah did not look surprised. He looked interested, which frightened her more. "There's movement up there," he said. "Maybe the clapper arm. Maybe something tied into the cradle, but we don't guess from underneath rotten timber." He opened his tool bag and took out a roll of orange flagging tape. At the bottom of the loft stairs, he tied a strip across the rail. "You want to save anything here, first thing is keeping water out and people off weak wood. Roof patch before interior. Porch brace before visitors. Belfry last unless it starts shifting. I have $300. Then you start with tarp screws and not dying." He said it so plainly that Clara could not tell whether it was kindness until he handed her a spare flashlight. "Hardware store opens at 7, he added. "Ask Ruth for contractor bags and a cheap respirator. Tell her Jonah said put it on my account until Friday." "I can't let you do that." "You can let me keep an old building from killing Clara Wren's granddaughter." The words struck harder than Clara expected. She turned away under the pretense of looking at the pews. By late afternoon, Jonah had gone, taking the ladder with him and leaving behind more warnings than answers. Clara used the last usable daylight to bag loose trash from the vestibule and move the wettest hymnals off the floor. She did not throw them away. She stacked them on a dry pew and placed a stone on top as if weight could hold their swollen pages together. There was no room in her for trust yet. Not in the building, not in Lila's silence, not in a bell that answered wind. But the chapel had become something more difficult to abandon than it had been that morning. She took the gray scarf from around her neck and tied it to the end of a broken pew near the center aisle. The knot was careful, the way Lila had taught her to tie thread before trimming it close. In the dim nave, the scarf made a small marker of warmth against the old pine. Clara spread her sleeping bag beneath the choir loft far from the stained ceiling and the cracked glass and lay down with the flashlight beside her hand. Above her the cut rope hung still. Clara marked the time in pencil on the inside cover of a swollen hymnal. "I am." She had woken before the bell this time. Not because she expected courage to arrive with morning, but because cold had worked through the sleeping bag and settled into her hips. The chapel around her was still gray. Her flashlight lay dead beside her hand. In the east window, the cracked glass held a thin line of paling sky. She sat on the floorboards beneath the choir loft with the hymnal balanced on her knees, listening so hard that ordinary sounds became separate things. Water ticking from the vestry ceiling into a bucket. A branch brushing clapboard. Her own breath catching in the gray scarf tied to the pew beside her. At 6:47, wind pressed against the chapel. The east window trembled once. Somewhere above the loft, metal shifted with a dry scrape. Then the bell gave one low note. It was softer than the first morning, but cleaner than the dull tap Jonah had heard. The sound moved down through the ceiling and into the boards beneath Clara, a single bronze syllable that seemed too intentional for weather and too physical for anything else. She wrote 6:47, wind from east, one ring, rope still. Her hand shook only after the pencil stopped. By 7:30, she was at the hardware store waiting beside the locked front door with her coat collar turned up. Ruth Calder opened from inside a square woman in a blue vest with measuring tape hanging around her neck like a necklace. She looked at Clara, then at the mud on Clara's boots, then at the gray sky over the street. "You are Lila's granddaughter," Ruth said. Clara had stopped being surprised by the way her grandmother's name traveled faster than she did. "I need contractor bags, a respirator, and whatever keeps a tarp on a roof without making the roof worse." Ruth unlocked the door. "That depends on whether the roof is already worse." "It is." "Then we will start with not making it worse." She set out heavy bags, a box of disposable respirators, work gloves, a roll of plastic sheeting, and 2 packs of roofing screws with rubber washers. When Clara reached for her wallet, Ruth waved one hand toward the back counter. Jonah called, "I can't keep taking credit from people." "Then call it a tab until you know what you are doing." "I don't know what I'm doing." "That is why it is a tab and not a loan." Ruth wrote Clara's name in a spiral notebook instead of a register, tore a sheet of cardboard from a box, and drew a rough diagram of how to lap plastic over a leak so rain did not run underneath it. The drawing was plain enough for Clara to understand and careful enough to make her throat tighten. At 9, Jonah arrived at the chapel with 2 lengths of lumber in the bed of his truck and a face that said he had already decided she would be difficult. "Did it ring?" he asked. 6:47. Wind. East. "Good. You wrote it down." Clara held up the hymnal. Jonah's mouth moved like he almost approved. "Then we test what can be tested from the floor." He would not let her climb, but he let her work. Together, they cleared the aisle, moved 2 pews away from the worst ceiling stain, and set a tarp over the vestry leak from the outside using Jonah's extension pole and more patience than Clara possessed. He showed her how to keep her feet over framing when the porch boards flexed, how to push on a post with gradual pressure instead of trusting its appearance, and how to read water damage by following the darkest line to its highest point. Inside, they opened the front door wide and let the cold air move through. Jonah tied a string to the cut rope end without pulling it. The remaining rope turned slightly stiff and unwilling. Nothing sounded above. "Dead line," he said. "Could someone have another rope up there?" "Maybe, but you would see a second line through the chase unless it was offset." He shone his flashlight up through the ceiling hole. Dust lit the beam. "Bell ropes usually come straight down or close to it. This one was cut because nobody trusted the belfry." He placed a level against the loft stairs, then against the wall beside them. He muttered numbers under his breath and marked 2 spots with blue painter's tape. "You said cradle yesterday," Clara said. "The bell sits on a yoke. The frame around it carries the load. Sometimes folks call the whole support a cradle. If a brace, loosened a bell, can move more than it should. If the clapper hangs wrong, wind can help it kiss the rim." Kiss. That is the polite word for metal hitting metal when it ought not. He had Clara stand in the nave while he walked the outside wall. At his instruction, she watched the cut rope, the ceiling hole, and the dust near the loft rail. When a gust came, the east window ticked again. Above them, the faint scrape returned, followed by no note. Again, Jonah called from outside. "The wind does not take requests," Clara called back. "It does in these hills. You just have to wait longer than you want." They waited nearly 20 minutes. During the next gust, Clara saw it, not the rope moving, not the ceiling, but a thin line of dust trembling along the top of the choir loft rail. Something behind or above the rail was vibrating. She stepped closer, careful of the weak stairs, and angled Jonah's flashlight across the loft floor. There were marks in the dust near the right wall. Not footprints, not animal tracks. 3 crescent-shaped scuffs pale against the darker film as if a curved piece of metal or wood had rubbed there more than once. They sat beneath the east louver side of the belfry, just beyond the broken third stair, where no one could safely reach without bracing. "Jonah," she said. He came in, followed her light, and grew quiet. "That old service panel may still be up there," he said. "What service panel?" "For reaching the bell hardware without going outside. Small churches had whatever the builder could manage. A removable board, a hatch a panel behind the loft. Every one different. So there might be a way to see it. There might be a way to fall through trying." By noon, he had built a temporary bracing for the stair stringer from the lumber in his truck. He made Clara hold the boards while he set screws by hand, first explaining that old dry wood split if rushed. He did not make the stairs safe enough for a crowd. He made them safe enough for one careful person with another watching. "You put your weight where I tell you," he said. "No reaching past your balance. No stepping on anything I have not touched first." Clara nodded. "I mean it. I know. No, you want an answer. Wanting an answer makes people stupid." That was true enough that she did not argue. The stairs creaked under Jonah first. He tested each tread, shifted his weight, and climbed into the loft. Clara followed, one hand on the wall, one on the rail that Jonah had told her not to trust. Up close, the loft smelled of animal nests and old hymn paper. The floorboards were narrower than those in the nave, and several near the east wall had dark stains where wind-driven rain had entered through the louvers above. The scuff marks were clearer there. They curved toward a section of beadboard that did not quite match the rest. Clara knelt, keeping both knees on a board. Jonah tapped as sound. A vertical seam ran behind a strip of trim. At the top, a louver pin projected through from the belfry, opening iron dark and dust-caked. Jonah brushed the trim with 2 fingers. "Somebody took this off before. Recently. No, but more than once. I used a small pry bar with a cloth under it to protect the wood. The trim resisted, then gave with a soft crack of old paint. Behind it was a narrow panel no wider than Clara's forearm, held by a wooden turn button blackened with age." Clara's pulse began to beat in her ears. Jonah looked at her. "You open it, slowly." The turn button moved with a gritty whisper. Clara eased the panel outward. Cold air slipped through the gap, carrying the smell of wet wood rust and something faintly oily. Behind the panel was not a room, not a dramatic hollow, only a cramped service space between the loft wall and the lower belfry frame. A diagonal brace crossed it. Beyond that, in shadow, the bell's support timbers rose into darkness. Something brass swung lightly from a bent iron hook. Not the bell clapper. Smaller. A weight perhaps 5 inches long, shaped like a short, rounded cylinder with a flattened side. It hung by a length of old wire from part of the bell frame positioned so that when wind pushed through the damaged east louver, it could swing inward and strike a secondary rod connected to the clapper arm. Jonah exhaled. "Well," he said, "that is not standard." Clara reached toward it. "No fingers in there yet." She withdrew her hand. Jonah studied the wire, the angle of the rod, the scrape marks on the nearby board, and the bright line where brass had rubbed against iron. This was rigged, not yesterday, not by accident either. To ring the bell. To make it answer under certain wind. East wind at dawn, maybe, if sun warms one side and air moves uphill. It would not take much if the clapper is already close. Why would anyone do that? That is the question old buildings ask when they are tired of being ignored. He let her hold the flashlight while he unhooked the brass weight with needle-nose pliers. It came free, heavier than she expected, dropping into his gloved palm with a muted thud. Wrapped around its wire was a strip of oilcloth, brittle at the edges but intact. Jonah passed the whole thing to Clara only after making sure nothing else shifted. The brass was cold at first, then warmed quickly against her glove. On the flattened side beneath grime 3 initials had been scratched by hand. EMO. Below them was a date, 1934. Clara did not recognize the initials. She did recognize the W. Jonah saw her face and said nothing. They climbed down before opening anything further. Jonah insisted on that. He closed the service panel, replaced the trim loosely, and marked the stair rail with a second strip of orange tape. On the nave floor, Clara laid the oilcloth packet on the least warped pew and peeled back one corner. Inside was paper, not one sheet but several folded pieces tied with cotton string darkened by age. The top page showed only a line of handwriting before Jonah put his hand gently over the packet. "Not here," he said. "I need to know. You need these papers not to curl tear or mold in your hands. Old paper that has lived in damp air can break just because somebody is impatient." Clara looked down at the exposed line. Relief account, winter distribution. That was all she saw before Jonah covered it again. The phrase did not explain the bell. It did not explain Lila's secrecy, or the chapel, or why a brass weight had waited above a cut rope for 40 years. But it changed the shape of the mystery. This was not only a mechanism. It was a message designed to survive neglect, wind, and time. They drove to the library with the packet inside a cardboard box Ruth had given Clara for purchases. May Ellison met them in the local history room where the air was dry and the tables were clean. She did not touch the papers until she had washed her hands and brought out 2 sheets of unbleached blotting paper. "Oilcloth help," May said. "Do not flatten anything by force." She lifted the top fold with the patience of someone waking a child. There were names, dates, small amounts beside them: coal, flour, medicine, rail fare, Widow Hensley $2, price family 50 cents, Wren Emma M. notation keeper. Jonah stepped back from the table. Clara noticed. Price family. His eyes stayed on this page. "My mother was born a Price, but half the valley was somebody's cousin then." May adjusted her red glasses. This chapel did more than hold Sunday service. "What was it?" Clara asked. May looked toward the window where late light had begun to silver the library glass. Maybe a place of people came when they were too proud to ask in daylight. The room went quiet around that. Clara thought of Lila sitting here every spring asking for the same folder, carrying a secret back out into ordinary weather. She thought of the cut rope, the hidden weight, the bell speaking only when conditions were exact enough to make listening necessary. Her grandmother had not left her an escape. She had left her a locked question, and the first key had been sound. When May folded the oilcloth back around the papers, Clara picked up the brass weight. The grime had rubbed away where her thumb rested. The initials caught the light, now shallow but deliberate. EMO. Emma May, Wren May suggested softly after checking a church note from 1937. Clara's great-grandmother, perhaps. Not proof yet, but a path. Outside the library, the cold had sharpened. Jonah walked Clara to her car without speaking. At the driver's door, he looked at the cardboard box on the seat. "Tomorrow, we brace the porch if you still mean to keep people from stripping it." "I do." "Then bring coffee." "I have $300. "Then bring bad coffee." He turned toward his truck, then stopped. "Clara." She looked up. "Your grandmother was not careless. If she hid this from you, she had a reason. But reasons are not always excuses." That stayed with her all the way back to the chapel. Placed the brass striker weight beside it. The chapel was colder than the library, rougher, less certain, but it no longer felt empty. She stood beneath the choir loft and looked up toward the hidden panel she could not see from the floor. The cut rope hung in front of her, still useless. Above it, somewhere behind old boards and louvered shadow, a mechanism made by human hands had waited for an east wind to ask for witness. Clara opened her palm. The brass weight rested there, still warm from the sunlit belfry. Clara opened the oilcloth packet on the vestry table while rain tapped through the patched roof pan and gathered in the bucket beneath it. The sound was steadier than the bell had been, less mysterious and more demanding. Every drop reminded her that paper could be saved only if the building stopped leaking long enough to let it dry. May had sent her back with blotting paper cotton gloves, 2 acid-free folders, and instructions written in block letters across an index card. Do not force folds. Do not stack damp pages. Photograph before moving. Stop if ink feathers. Clara obeyed as if the rules were medication. The vestry smelled of wet pine and old lamp soot. Jonah had left a work light clipped to a shelf, its cord running to the small generator outside, and the bulb cast a yellow circle over the table. Clara set her phone on a hymnal stand camera facing down and photographed the packet before touching the string. The cotton tie broke when she loosened it. She closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them and went on. The top document was not a letter. It was a ledger page ruled in faint blue lines, the left margin filled with names and the right with small sums written in a narrow hand. Some entries were practical enough to be almost bare. Coal half sack, milk for infant, rail fare east. Dr. Harlan paid discreet, flour 8 pounds, boot leather. Beside several names was the same mark bell. Clara copied the word into her notebook and underlined it once. She did not know whether it meant the family had been called by the bell or protected by it, only that someone had cared enough to mark the difference. The next page carried the heading Relief Account, Winter Distribution, 1934. Beneath it, in a different hand, someone had written no names read aloud, no debt spoken from the pulpit. Clara sat back. The chapel, now beyond the vestry door, was dark except for the work light spilling across the first pew. In that dimness, the cut rope looked like a question hanging in public. She imagined people walking up the muddy road in winter with their coats buttoned wrong, pretending they had come for worship when they had come for cauliflower fare or medicine. She imagined a bell ringing once so no one had to knock. A folded sheet lay between two ledger pages. The paper was thinner, cream-colored, and less stained. Lila's handwriting began halfway down the first side, smaller than it had been on birthday cards, but still unmistakable. My Clara, if Mr. Hale kept his promise, you found the key after I was gone. I did not trust myself to give it to you, while I could still ask forgiveness. There are some things a person hides because she is ashamed, and some things because the world has taught her how quickly kindness can be stripped for parts. This chapel was never grand. Your great-grandmother, Emma May. Wren kept the relief book here when the railroad men were laid off, when lumber work slowed, when a widow's stove went cold, when children needed shoes more than sermons. Money came in quietly. Help went out quietly. The bell was rung once for those who should enter by the vestry door and never be made to stand in front of the town with their need showing. Clara stopped reading and looked at the brass weight beside the folders. EMO. Emma May Wren had not simply written in the ledger. She had helped build the strange little mechanism hidden above the choir loft, or at least she had known why it mattered. A bell note without a hand on the rope. A signal that seemed to come from the building itself, sparing whoever needed help from being seen asking. Rain struck the pan faster, then slowed. Clara read on. When the chapel closed, people wanted the bell. Then the pews. Then the colored glass. Your great-grandfather said a dead building owed the living whatever could be sold. Emma said a promise did not die because paint peeled. She hid the records before anyone could use the names as gossip or debt. Years later, I found them as a girl and did not understand why my mother cried when I showed her. I paid the taxes because I knew what those names meant. I did not tell you because your life was already full of my needs. That was wrong. Love can become another locked room if we mistake silence for protection. Clara pressed her gloved hand flat beside the page, not on it. Her throat hurt, but the hurt had edges. It was not the empty collapse that had followed the funeral. It was sharper, made of anger and tenderness together. Leela had known. All those afternoons when Clara counted pills, argued with insurance recordings, and cut her own hair over the bathroom sink to save money. Lila had known there was land, a building, a debt, and a bell waiting in the mountains. She had kept it folded away until Clara had nowhere else to go. Outside tires moved over wet gravel. Clara covered the papers with blotting sheets before she stood. Martin Voss did not knock. He stepped into the nave with his tan jacket darkened at the shoulders and a folded tarp under one arm, as if bringing proof of usefulness. Door was open, he said. It was not an invitation. He glanced past her toward the vestry table. You been digging. I've been sorting my grandmother's property. That bell is going to waste up there. I can give you $1,500 if we settle today. Cash by evening. Yesterday, the number might have lifted her out of herself. Today, it sounded small inside the chapel. The bell stays. Voss looked up towards the loft. You get an engineer to say that belfry is sound. No, then it may come down on its own. Difference is, with me, you get paid before it does. Clara walked to the front pew and placed herself between him and the vestry. Her boots left damp prints on the dusty floor. The county gave me 30 days to respond. Responding is not repairing. No, but selling off pieces is not repair either. His mouth tightened. Your grandmother said the same sort of thing. Cost her money she did not have. That struck close enough that Clara nearly answered with cruelty. Instead, she looked at the place where the pulpit had once stood. The pale rectangle on the floor was clear even in low light and absence preserved by dust. Did she ever tell you why she kept it? Old people get attached. Then you miss the important part. Voss laughed once under his breath and tucked the tarp more tightly beneath his arm. You will call me when the bill arrives. No, Clara said. I do not think I will. He left his card on the nearest pew this time face up as if the chapel itself might reconsider. When his truck was gone, Clara locked the door. Her hands shook on the key. Not from fear of him exactly, but from the cost of refusing what she needed. $1,500 would have bought breathing room. The Bell staying bought nothing she could put in a bank. She returned to the vestry and lifted the blotting paper. Lila's letter had one more paragraph. If you find the ledger, protect the living families in it. If you find the other paper, you will know what I could not finish. And if you hear the bell before you understand it, do not be afraid. Some bells are not calling the living to look up, but asking them to remember who was left below. Clara read the sentence 3 times. Below, not beneath the earth. Not dead, or at least not only dead. Below the notice of people with dry roofs, full cupboards, and names that did not need protecting. Below the stairs to the loft. Below the bell. Below the kind of history towns framed and hung on walls. She photographed the page, then set it between fresh blotting sheets. The ledger came next, page after page of quiet arithmetic. 50 cents here. A sack of cornmeal there. A note beside Jonah's family name in 1941, mother, ill no public mention. Clara understood then why he had stepped back in the library. A stranger might have called it charity. The chapel had called it mercy and kept its mouth shut. Near the bottom of a loose page, a newer hand had added a line in pencil. LW reviewed April 1998. Names remain sealed until use can honor them. Lila had not forgotten the chapel. She had visited it in paper form every spring, making sure the past stayed protected even as the building failed in weather. Clara worked until the generator sputtered and the light dimmed. She had photographed every page she dared unfold and written a numbered list without private names, coal distribution, medical payments, rail fares, food allotments, widow support, child clothing, bell mark. Evidence but not exposure. When Jonah arrived near dusk with a roll of plastic and 2 cups of gas station coffee, he found her sitting on the platform steps with the brass weight in both hands. Bad coffee, he said, holding one out. She took it. Your mother is in the ledger. He looked toward the vestry door and then at the floor. I thought she might be. I won't show anyone her name. I know. Did Lila help her? Before my time. He lowered himself onto the pew across the aisle, moving carefully around the weak board he had marked that morning. But my mother kept a jar of coins in the kitchen. Called it bell money. If someone needed groceries, she took from the jar and never wrote down who. The chapel settled around them with small wooden sounds. Voss came back, Clara said. Figured he would. I said no. Jonah nodded once as if she had set the first straight board in a crooked wall. Then, tomorrow, we start making that Clara looked from him to the cut rope. The ledger had not solved the county notice. The roof still leaked, the porch still sagged. Her money was still almost gone. But the chapel no longer felt like a ruin left behind by people who stopped caring. It felt like a promise interrupted. She rose, carried the brass weight to the front of the nave, and laid it on the pew beneath the rope. The cut end hung above it, dark and blunt. One had been silenced by fear, or weather, or human decision. The other had kept finding a way to speak. Clara laid the ledger beside the cut bell rope and understood both were left unfinished. Jonah would not let Clara touch the roof until they had braced the porch. Rain gets the attention, he said, setting a bottle jack beneath the lowest corner post. But gravity is the one that finishes a building. The morning after the ledger was opened, the chapel stood in wet light with its front steps dark from rain. Clara held a scrap of plywood against the mud, while Jonah eased the jack upward a quarter turn at a time. The porch did not rise so much as remember its shape. Old nails complained. Water ran from the edge of the roof in thin streams and struck the leaves below. "Slow," Jonah said. "If you force old wood, it teaches you manners." Clara worked in gloves Ruth had given her from a torn package she could not sell. She carried short lengths of treated lumber-held braces, while Jonah checked angles and learned the difference between a board that looked ugly and a board that could no longer carry weight. The corner post had rot at the foot where Splashback had fed it for years. They cut away what had failed, set a temporary support on a flat stone, and marked the permanent repair for later. Only then did they address the leak. They did not climb onto the roof. Jonah tied plastic sheeting to a long pole, and together they worked it over the vestry seam from the uphill side, lapping it so the water would run down and away instead of under the patch. Clara drove roofing screws with rubber washers where Jonah pointed. Her first two went crooked. The third seated cleanly washer flattening just enough to seal without tearing. By afternoon the bucket in the vestry had slowed from a steady tick to an occasional drop. It was not beautiful. It was not finished. But the building had lost one active wound. Clara stood beneath the patched ceiling and wrote the date on a strip of painter's tape emergency roof cover, East Vestry seam Jonah present. She stuck it to the shelf by the work light. Documentation May had said was another kind of care. That night, Clara slept in the car again because the chapel still smelled too damp, but she slept with less fear of waking to collapse. Ruth Calder gave Clara 3 mornings a week at the hardware store sorting returns and sweeping the back aisle before customers came in. It was not charity on paper. Ruth filled out a time card, wrote Clara's hourly rate in blue ink, and deducted part of it from the growing tab for screws masks, trash bags, plastic sheeting, and coffee. "You break anything expensive, I will be irritated in a professional capacity," Ruth said on the first morning. "I can avoid expensive aisles. That is not a skill. Learn where things go." So Clara learned. She learned that galvanized screws had their own bins, and that old men would ask for things by names, no package used anymore. She learned that lime was not cement, that respirators were sized, that cheap brushes lost bristles and varnish, and that a moisture meter could make a rotten wall confess before a finger went through it. After closing, Jonah met her at the chapel and turned small tasks into lessons. He showed her how to mark a board before cutting, how to drill a pilot hole near the end grain, how to sweep debris toward herself so nails did not scatter underfoot. When she rushed, he made her stop. When she apologized too much, he ignored it until she asked a better question. "Why roof before windows if the window is broken?" she asked one cold evening. "Because water falls down more reliably than it blows sideways. Stop the biggest source first." "What about the belfry?" "We inspect from below until we can brace from below. Pride goes up ladders, sense builds scaffolding." He spoke of buildings as if they were stubborn patients. Clara understood that language. For 3 years she had measured Lila's days by appetite, pulse, temperature, and breath. Now she measured the chapel by leaks, flex drafts, and stains. The habit of watching for decline had not left her. It had simply found wood instead of bone. Near the end of the week, Ruth handed her a used tool belt from beneath the counter. "Left behind by my nephew when he decided construction was beneath his spirit. I can't buy that." "I did not ask you to buy it. I asked you to take it out of my way." Clara put it on in the storage room. The belt sat awkwardly on her hips and smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil. In the mirror above the utility sink, she saw her olive coat, tired face, gray scarf, and the unfamiliar weight of pockets meant to hold useful things. For the first time since Lila's funeral, Clara looked less like someone carrying what was left and more like someone preparing to begin. May spread the ledger pages across 2 tables in the library's local history room and placed clean river stones at the corners of the blotting paper. The stones had felt bottoms and labels in May's neat handwriting, oak leaf, South Fork Chapel Road. "We weigh without pressing," May said. "We dry without hurrying. We copy without exposing." Clara sat beside her with the phone plugged in and the camera set square above each page. May had found an old copy stand in a closet and cleaned dust from its hinges. Under its frame, the ledger became less frightening. Page by page, it turned into work. They made 2 sets of notes. One preserved exact names in a sealed folder. The other listed only patterns, fuel assistance, food, medicine, rail fare, funeral costs, child clothing repairs after flood, winter relief. May explained that history did not require humiliating the descendants of people who had survived hard years. People confuse truth with access, May said, adjusting a page with a bone folder. Some truths should be held carefully before they are held publicly. Clara thought of Lila's sentence about silence becoming a locked room. She wondered how to tell the difference between protection and concealment before time made both look holy. A photograph from 1938 gave her one answer. It showed the chapel in winter clapboards, white and sound smoke rising from a stovepipe at the rear vestry. 6 women stood on the porch steps in dark coats. One of them, young and narrow-faced, held a ledger against her chest. On the back, someone had written, Emma Wren, Ruth Price, Mabel Hensley Distribution Morning. Ruth Price, Jonah's mother. Clara did not take the photograph from May's hand. She only looked. Does Jonah know this exists? He may suspect, May said. Let him choose when to see it. That evening, Clara brought only the pattern notes back to the chapel. She locked the name copies in a small metal file box May had lent her, then placed the box in the trunk of her car instead of leaving it under a leaking roof. Inside the chapel, the scarf still marked the broken pew. The brass weight lay wrapped in clean cloth. The cut rope hung above both. Clara opened her notebook and wrote a sentence for the county inspector. The chapel contains locally significant relief records requiring protection during structural review. It sounded dry. It sounded official. It also sounded like a way to keep Voss from turning mercy into salvage. The belfry could not be repaired from hope or anger, so Jonah brought 2 men from his old mill crew and made Clara listen before anyone lifted a tool. One was named Dale Broad, through the shoulders and quiet. The other, Henry, had a knee brace and a habit of tapping every board twice before trusting it. They set temporary planks across the loft floor, not as a platform for wandering, but as a path for weight. Jonah checked the stair braces again, then checked Clara's gloves. You are here to hand up tools and ask before touching anything. I know. You know in your head. I am speaking to your feet. They opened the service panel fully and removed 2 damaged louver slats from the east side. Cold daylight entered the cramped space, revealing the bell at last. It was smaller than Clara had imagined. From below, greened with age, its rim uneven with old casting marks. The yoke above it was wood, dark and checked but not broken. One iron strap had loosened. The clapper hung slightly off-center, close enough that a push from the rigged striker could make it sound. Jonah did not lower the bell to the floor. He secured it. A temporary strap went around the yoke. A padded brace held the clapper still. Henry tightened what could be tightened without cracking old fittings, and Dale cleaned bird nests from the corner with gloved hands and a contractor bag. Clara stood where Jonah told her, passing pliers, washers, a flashlight, and once, when asked the brass striker weight. This little thing has been busy, Henry said, turning it in his hand. It rang at dawn, Clara said. With that east louver broken, I believe it. Jonah showed her the path of motion. Whined through the damaged slats, brass weight swinging on wire. Secondary rod nudged. Clapper shifted just enough. One note, not every time, only when air and angle agreed. Why dawn? Clara asked. Cold air moving, sun catching the east side, uphill current waking. Mountains make small engines out of temperature. The explanation did not make the bell smaller. It made it more human. Someone had understood the building, the wind, and shame well enough to let a person ask for help without pulling a rope. They found no new papers in the belfry that day. Only dust nesting straw, a rusted nail tin, and bright wear marks where the hidden weight had done its work across decades. Jonah wrapped the weight again and gave it back to Clara. Bell stays in place, he said, but nobody rings it until we repair the pull properly. Clara looked down through the loft rail to the nave, where winter light lay across the pews and long, pale boards. I do not want to ring it yet, she said. At dusk, after the men left, Clara stayed to sweep the threshold. Layers of gray paint flaked up beneath the stiff EMU. Below it, almost hidden by dirt, were 2 smaller letters. LW. Clara knelt, sanding by hand with a scrap Jonah had left her, careful not to erase what she was trying to reveal. The initials emerged slowly, not as decoration, but as evidence of hands that had stood where she knelt now. At dusk, Clara sanded the chapel threshold until Lila's old initials appeared beneath gray paint. The first quilt arrived on a Tuesday morning in a black garbage bag. Clara found it hanging from the chapel door handle when she came up from town with 2 coffees and a paper sack of dented cans Ruth had marked half price. For one startled moment, she thought Voss had left something else to tempt her. Then she opened the bag and found folded cotton, clean and soft, patterned with faded blue squares. A note was pinned to the top, "For the vestry, if you are sleeping cold. My mother said Lila never let anyone leave Laurel Road without something warm." No name. Clara carried the quilt inside and set it on the driest pew. By noon, there were 2 more bags on the porch: canned soup, a box of tea-work socks, and a bundle of old photographs tied with ribbon. By evening, Ruth arrived in her hardware vest with a portable heater, she said, had a bad switch but a good heart. "Use it while you are awake," Ruth said. "Unplug it when you sleep. I am not interested in attending another meeting about this building because you toasted yourself." Clara almost refused, then looked at the quilt and stopped. Help came like that. Not as rescue, not as applause. It came in small, practical burdens placed where she would have to pick them up. A retired teacher brought a broom and stayed to sweep mouse nests from the vestibule. A man Clara had never met dropped off 2 5-gallon buckets of gravel for the muddy place by the porch steps. Annabelle, the choir teacher from the middle school, arrived with 4 former students and a stack of masks, and they cleaned pews in silence until one of the girls began humming. The sound lifted gently through the nave. Clara stood in the vestry doorway with a trash bag in one hand and listened. No one sang words. No one made the room sacred by force. But the old beadboard took the hum and gave it back warmer than it had received it. Jonah looked over from the loft stairs. Buildings remember use. Clara touched the gray scarf on the pew end. So do people. By mid-December, the vestry was dry enough to become a room. Not a pretty room. Not yet. The walls still wore stains that would need sealing, and the floor sloped slightly toward the outside corner where rot had started years before. But Jonah approved the temporary roof cover the stovepipe hole had been capped, and Ruth found a narrow cot in her sister's garage that folded against the wall during the day. Clara moved in on a Friday with 2 boxes, the quilt, and a plastic drawer unit bought from a thrift store for $9. She scrubbed the enamel basin until most of the rust gave way. She taped cardboard over the cracked pane until replacement glass could be cut. She set Lila's scarf at the foot of the cot, then moved it to the back of a chair because the bed looked too much like a sick room with it there. That night wind dragged bare branches along the chapel wall. Clara lay awake under the donated quilt, listening to the building make ordinary winter sounds. The bell did not ring. The secured clapper held. The rope hung silent. She expected shame to come once she was still. It had followed her everywhere since the duplex, into the car, into the library, through the hardware store aisles. A grown woman sleeping in an abandoned chapel. A granddaughter who had not known what her own family kept. A caretaker of something she could barely afford to heat. Instead, she heard rain move properly off the patched roof and into the gutter Jonah had cleared. That small success quieted her. In the morning, Clara made coffee on a camp stove outside the vestry door and wrote 3 columns in her notebook: immediate winter-spring. Under immediate, she wrote heat inspection document storage taxes. Under winter, she wrote roof estimate, porch repair, belfry plan, community letters. Under spring, she paused for a long time. Then she wrote open doors. She did not know yet what that meant. Only that the words no longer felt impossible. The second paper was found because Annabelle dropped a pencil. It rolled beneath the communion rail, struck the baseboard, and vanished through a gap Clara had swept past a dozen times. Anna knelt to reach for it, then called Clara over without raising her voice. "There is a loose plate here." Jonah was not present, so Clara did not pry. That was one of the new disciplines the chapel had taught her. She took photographs, marked the rail with blue tape, and waited until afternoon when Jonah arrived with a bag of biscuits and a look that said he already knew patience had cost her something. The plate was brass tarnished, nearly brown, held by two screws that had been painted over until they looked like knots. Jonah scored the paint before turning them. The plate came free with a soft snap revealing a shallow recess behind the rail support. Inside lay a sealed envelope, brittle but dry. On the front in Emma May Wren's hand were the words, "If the bell is ever sold, this must speak first." May opened it at the library the next morning. The paper inside was not dramatic. That disappointed Clara for half a second before she understood that important things often looked plain because they were meant to survive handling. It was a signed statement from 1942, witnessed by 3 chapel women and 1 county clerk, declaring that if regular worship ceased, the building and bell were to remain dedicated to relief shelter and remembrance for families along Laurel Branch under the care of any Wren descendant willing to maintain the trust. It was not a modern legal instrument. Mr. Hale said as much when Clara photographed it and brought it to his office. But it was evidence of intent tied to the deed history and enough to slow any simple salvage claim. "Can it save the chapel?" Clara asked. "Not by itself," he said. "Paper rarely saves wood, but paper can explain why wood is worth saving." He drafted a letter for the county. Clara signed it with hands steadier than she felt. The county hearing was held in a meeting room that smelled of floor wax and burnt coffee. Clara wore her olive coat because it was the warmest thing she owned, but she washed it the night before and brushed dried mud from the hem. Lila's gray scarf was folded in her bag instead of around her neck. She wanted one part of her grandmother there without needing everyone to see it. Jonah sat beside her. May sat behind them with a folder of copied records. Ruth came straight from the store, measuring tape still at her collar. Anna brought 2 photographs of the cleaned nave and one of her students carrying broken glass out in a bucket. Martin Voss sat on the other side of the aisle. The inspector was not unkind. He was also not sentimental. He asked about roof stabilization, public access, fire safety porch support, and how Clara intended to prevent trespass while repairs continued. Jonah answered structural questions plainly. Clara gave dates, receipts, photographs, and the repair order she had learned by doing it wrong in her mind before doing it right with her hands. Roof before paint. Drainage before floors. Bracing before belfry. Dry storage before display. No public use until inspected. May explained the ledger without naming families. Mr. Hale explained the deed history and the 1942 statement without pretending it was magic. Ruth placed the hardware tab on the table and said, "She is paying it down." Anna said the student had asked to come back in spring. When Voss spoke, he used words like liability, deterioration, and recoverable materials. He did not sound cruel. He sounded efficient. Clara understood then why Lila had been afraid. Not because everyone who wanted the chapel's pieces was wicked, but because usefulness without memory could make destruction sound reasonable. The inspector granted 90 days for documented stabilization, restricted occupancy, and a follow-up review. It was not victory. It was time. Outside, Clara stood on the county building steps while traffic moved through a gray afternoon. Jonah handed her the folder, heavier now, with official paper. "You did not save it today," he said. "I know. You kept it from being ended." Clara looked toward the mountains, their ridges layered blue beyond the town. That may be the same thing for now. By April, the chapel no longer looked abandoned from the road. It still looked old. Clara wanted that. The clapboards had been scraped and primed only where weather demanded it, leaving the building's age visible beneath fresh white paint. The porch stood level on repaired posts. The east window held new glass in the cracked lower pane, while the small mountain panel above the platform had been cleaned until amber and green light returned to the floor in quiet pieces. The roof no longer leaked. That fact pleased Clara more than any compliment could have. Rain came hard the first week of April, running down the tin roof and into cleared gutters, falling away from the foundation instead of entering the vestry wall. Clara stood inside during the storm and watched the bucket remain empty. She took a photograph of the dry floor and sent it to Jonah. He replied about time the roof learned manners. The belfry repair took the longest. Jonah would not hurry it. The bell remained in place while Dale and Henry replaced one compromised brace, cleaned the iron strap, and set the clapper back to center. The hidden striker mechanism was not restored to working use. Clara made that decision after a week of thinking. The brass weight belonged to the story of the chapel, but the old secret signal had served people who needed secrecy because pride and gossip had made need dangerous. The new chapel would not make anyone knock in shame. Still, she preserved the weight. May helped her mount it inside a shallow drawer beneath a locked display case beside a redacted copy of the relief ledger, Emma's photograph, and Lila's short note about bells and memory. The original pages were stored in archival folders at the library with access rules that protected family names unless descendants chose otherwise. The second paper changed Clara's future in a quieter way. Mr. Hale used the 1942 statement, the deed chain, and Lila's tax records to form the Laurel Branch Chapel Trust. It was small, plain, and full of phrases Clara had to read twice. The chapel would not belong to her in the way a house could be sold when fear came back. It would be held for relief, remembrance, and community use. Clara would serve as caretaker for 3 years with the right to live in the vestry room as long as she maintained the property and kept records open in protected form. "You can refuse this," Mr. Hale told her when he slid the papers across his desk. Clara looked at the signature line. Her bank account was still thin. Her job at the hardware store was part-time. The vestry room was smaller than the rented room she had lost. None of this resembled the rescue people imagined when they heard the word inheritance. But she thought of Lila writing that love could become a locked room. Then she signed. No bell rang when she did. No light changed. Mr. Hale simply notarized the page and gave her a copy in a blue folder. Clara carried it to the car under her coat because rain had started again, and she laughed once when she realized she was protecting paper from water, as if that had become her whole life. The chapel opened on the last Saturday of April. They did not call it a ceremony. Clara refused that word. The county inspector had approved limited use, no large gatherings, no cooking inside, no candles, no unsupervised loft access. Ruth donated a metal cabinet for canned goods and labeled the shelves in black marker. Anna brought 6 folding chairs for the vestry. May placed a small sign near the ledger display explaining the chapel's relief history without exposing private names. Jonah repaired the front threshold with a clear finish that left Emma's and Lila's initials visible beneath the door. At 8 that morning, Clara swept the porch. She wore the olive coat open over a clean blue shirt Ruth had found in the store's lost and found box and washed without mentioning it. Her brown boots were still worn, but she had oiled them the night before. Lila's gray scarf was folded over the back of the front pew, not as a relic, not as a wound, but as something welcome to touch. The first person through the door was a woman with 2 children and an empty grocery bag folded in her hand. She did not give her name. Clara did not ask for it. She showed her the cabinet, the tea kettle, and the shelf where donated socks were stacked by size. "Take what helps," Clara said. "Leave what you do not need." The woman nodded without looking directly at her. One child stared up at the bell rope newly spliced and hanging within reach near the front. "Does it work?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said, "but we ring it gently." By noon, 7 people had come and gone. Some brought things. Some took things. Some stood in the nave and read the display. Jonah's hands stayed in his pockets when he finally looked at the photograph of his mother on the porch steps in 1938. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was rough. "She never told me. Maybe she wanted you to feel fed, not indebted." He nodded, eyes still on the picture. "That sounds like her." Later, 2 teenagers from Anna's choir group arrived to help Clara label repair photographs. One of them, a serious girl named Tessa, asked why every receipt mattered if the work was already done. "Because memory gets stronger when it has evidence," Clara said. Tessa wrote that down in the margin of the project binder. By late afternoon, the chapel had settled into a kind of ordinary use that felt more sacred than ceremony would have. Someone had washed cups in the enamel basin. Someone had left a jar of peanut butter. Someone had tucked $3 into the donation box and written bell money on the envelope. Clara found the envelope after everyone left. She stood alone in the nave with spring light reaching across the repaired floorboards. The old cut rope had not been thrown away. A preserved section was braided into the new pole near the bottom, rough against smoother cord past and present held in the same hand's reach. Above the bell waited inside its braced frame, no longer dependent on accident wind or hidden mechanism. Clara took Lila's scarf from the pew and wrapped it once around her shoulders. For months, she had thought the chapel was asking her to solve something. The bell, the ledger, the reason Lila had waited. But the work had taught her that some questions were not solved once. They were answered in repeated acts: a patched roof, a protected name, a shelf of soup, a door unlocked at the promised hour. She looked toward the threshold where Emma's and Lila's initials showed under the clear finish. "Some bells are not calling the living to look up," Clara said softly, but asking them to remember who was left below. The words no longer sounded like warning. She took the bell rope in both hands. The old fibers in the braided section scratched her palm. She pulled once, not hard. It moved through the rafters over the clean pews across the vestry room where Clara's cot was folded against the... Clara knew better now. It had been speaking all along. It had spoken through Emma's careful ledger, through Lila's delayed courage, through Jonah's rough lessons, through May's protected folders, through Ruth's tab book, through every quiet hand that brought warmth without asking to be thanked. The note faded into the trees. Clara left the doors open. Spring light crossed the repaired floorboards as the bell note rolled down the mountain, and the chapel waited, not empty anymore, for whoever needed to come in from the cold.